Joining us now to discuss all of it, Ed Morrissey, the managing editor over at Hot Air and the host of the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Ed, always good to talk to you, sir.
Thank you for having me on.
Sanity seems to be prevailing for the most part.
Well, for the most part, right? I mean, this has been a pretty impressive 4 weeks.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that if Donald Trump had a first 4 weeks in 2017 like this, he would have won very easily in 2020. And I think he's setting up Republicans pretty well for the midterms.
Yes.
With a lot of this.
You know, the Department of Government Efficiency is one of the rare times the Republicans have associated themselves with a name that actually makes sense. Like usually Washington comes up with these stupid acronyms that nobody can really get their arms around and become invested in. But people understand government efficiency. That's what they want. Isn't it amazing that Trump has figured out how to get the left to protest government efficiency?
Yes, I mean, it's one of those really interesting moments, right, is that you're going to protest over actual scrutiny and actual accountability for trillions of dollars of federal spending. It's really sort of a remarkable moment. There's either two explanations for this. Either they are just doing the automatic gainsay of anything that Donald Trump does, and that's their only response, or they're part of the grift.
Yes.
And I think it could be either, or it could be both at the same time. But if Democrats want to run on you don't deserve to know where your money's going for their midterm message, I welcome them to that.
Yeah, but they're calling this authoritarian. They're acting as if Trump is some sort of, dictator who's trying to assume power unto himself. If so, he's the rare authoritarian who's using his power to strip the government of influence over the American people.
Well, it's not authoritarian. This is an exercise of executive power. The executive branch has always had the authority to scrutinize federal spending and in fact, they have the duty to do that,
yeah.
Right? I mean, it's an actual duty. That's part of the executive branch's authority, and that's the reason why judges the last few days have just decided, you know what, I think we need to stay out of this because this is really a political question. It's not really a legal question because there's no question. There's no legal question to this. The executive branch has the authority to look at all this spending. Now, the only thing that could cross the line is if Trump seizes money that was specifically appropriated by Congress for a specific purpose. Mm-hmm. That's going to be few and far between.
Yes. In other words, he takes that money and then uses it for some other intent that Congress didn't authorize.
Right. And even then, there's ways around that. We had that with the border wall in the
right.
first term and that sort of thing. And,
right.
Biden did that too. But for the most part, if Congress has explicitly appropriated money for a specific purpose, then you can't really stop it in the executive branch. And that's the reason why they didn't just shut USAID down. There are some functions in there that are explicitly part of the statutory scheme, and they have to keep those alive. But they can lay off 90% of the workers because it was almost the rest of it was just a slush fund.
Yes.
I would say 90 to 95% of that money was slush fund. And you had 14,000 people at USAID that were, or almost 14,000, that were treating it as a slush fund. And they were sending it to their favorite groups, and they were sending it to allies in politics, activists that were going to campaign for progressives, use the money to employ people who do that type of activity. It's a grift, and they're shutting down the grift, and there's really not a lot that courts can do about that. Congress could do something about it. If there's a program that gets shut down at USAID, and you see this, I mean, this is all the last 2 weekends, right? Tim Kaine goes out there, oh, this is hurting veterans. Really? Which program? Because if you know which program that they're shutting down that hurt veterans, why don't you propose that Congress fund that explicitly?
Yes.
Write a bill. That's what Congress is supposed to do. That's Congress's job. And if they wrote a bill and they got enough votes for it and Donald Trump signed the bill, then that money would be restored.
So
yeah, they're not doing that.
And they're doing a lot of conjuring fantasy scenarios right now in order to scare the American people. So, for instance, DOGE is taking a close look at the way that the Social Security Administration operates, and they've discovered that there's all sorts of people who are alleged to be alive who are, like somewhere in the vicinity of 150 years old. Well, it takes 2 seconds to be like, well, that's probably not real. So we should probably clean up this system so it's an accurate reflection of who's supposed to receive money. Let's make sure we don't have any checks going out the door to someone who claims to be 150 years old but isn't alive anymore. That makes That makes sense. But the way the left reacts to this is, oh, no, they're going after your Social Security or auditing the IRS, which is one of the things that DOGE is undertaking right now. We haven't even gotten refund checks this year. We haven't passed April 15th yet. And yet Democrats are saying if your refund checks are delayed, it will be because of DOGE. Ed Morrissey, if you have to conjure up fantasy events, it certainly suggests you don't have anything real to point to.
No, that's exactly correct, right? I mean, that's exactly correct. And it's not as though the IRS doesn't have a few employees that are supposed to be doing these things anyway, and they're going to be doing them. And again, some of this is statutory, some of it's regulatory, and some of it is just done by executive fiat, and that's the stuff that Donald Trump can stop.
Yeah.
And I don't think, I mean, if Democrats want to run on, save the IRS in 2026, I mean, God bless you.
Yeah.
I mean, really, they kind of did, right? I mean, this is the thing about the IRS that cracks me up. Democrats were screaming about Elon Musk and his DOGE team are going to have access to your personal records at the IRS and at Social Security, and it's the same people screaming about this that were cheering Joe Biden for hiring 87,000 people to come into the IRS to take a look at your personal information so that they can audit you.
Right.
I mean, there's no consistency to this.
Yeah.
And the level of hysteria over this is absolutely absurd. The problem is that they just didn't expect them to do it.
I know.
And they built some of these systems. I mean, the U.S. DOGE service is a great example of this. Barack Obama created that. He created it so it didn't have congressional oversight, and he created it so that they could go through and look at all the different, IT systems throughout the federal government, ostensibly to improve them, but more just to, promote activism, progressive activism throughout the federal government.
Yes.
And Trump largely ignored it in the first term because he didn't really understand what it was. But he understands it now, and so he took it over. He renamed it the U.S. DOGE Service, but it's the same organization, brought in Elon Musk's team to go through and do exactly what they were supposed to be doing, which is looking at all the different IT systems throughout the federal government, only this time to take a look where the money was going.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I love that Obama created this, and now we can use it to make the government more efficient. And that's not at all what Obama intended for it to be, which is the best thing ever.
It is. It's one of the great dunks of all time. I mean, honestly, I'm enjoying the heck out of this. But it does also point out the fact that when you give the executive branch that much power, somebody at some point is going to come along and use it for stuff you don't like, which is the reason why it's a good idea to have checks and balances, to make sure you're not making the executive branch too large, so that Congress has a chance to take a look at some of the actions there. This is not just the Obama years, it's not just the Biden years. This is like 100 years or more of agency law where Congress basically conceded most of its authority to the executive branch. This is what happens.
Yeah, it's funny, too, to think about that. What President Trump is doing right now is reasserting executive authority as found in the United States Constitution while simultaneously shrinking the government. The doomsday scenario is always like, oh, no, we're going to have somebody who thinks he's a king come in and then assume power over everybody's lives. Trump's doing the opposite. He's coming in and saying, look, Article 2 grants these powers to the executive branch, and I'm going to use them to cut the fat.
Not just Article 2. And if it was just Article 2, we wouldn't have this problem. The problem is that Congress passed enabling statutes for all of these agencies, and with all sorts of and legislation underneath them, with all sorts of language like the Secretary shall determine, the Secretary shall determine, the Secretary shall determine. Obamacare is practically a master class in this.
Yeah.
In which Congress basically conceded all of their power and authority to executive branch appointees at HHS, in all of these different places. So Trump is using that authority to do the exact same thing. And they're fit to be tied over it, but they're the ones that created this. And again, not just the recent Congresses. This goes back to Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. They've been doing this since Woodrow Wilson. It's just been getting worse and worse and worse over the years. And Trump is finally going to make progressives pay for it.
It's
and
amazing.
They're not happy.
Okay, so tell me about what corporate America is up to, because it seems like, everything from the tech company CEOs showing up to the inauguration to committing to stopping all of the censorship they've been doing of the American people to even, as I mentioned at the outset of this segment, Disney is now reeling back on all of its so-called DEI initiatives, which are just a euphemistic way of saying bigotry. And they're getting rid of, like, even the trigger warnings that they were airing on Disney Plus ahead of movies like Dumbo and Peter Pan. What is happening here, Ed Morrissey?
Well, they're falling in line with the dominant political culture. I mean, progressives have always been on the fringe. It's just that they have never had to pay for that. You know, there's something interesting, too, today. GSA today, apparently, or early today or late yesterday, announced that they were going to remove the requirement that federal agencies have to consider federal contractors' DEI policies before granting contracts. And they're not saying that companies can't do DEI, but what they're saying is that the federal government is no longer going to incentivize it. And I think that is something that is going to make corporate America just happy as all get out, because I don't think they ever really wanted those things. It's just that's where the money was. And so you ask, well, why are all these people showing up for Trump and donating to the Trump inauguration? It's because that's where they perceive the money's going to be. It's certainly where the power is going to be exercised. And Donald Trump has made it very clear that he's really going to exercise that power. And they don't want to be on the other side of it.
Yeah, they don't. And the reality, of course, they also have the threat looming over them of the various agencies who may judge them for that bigotry and say, wait a second, this is illegal. Like some of this stuff that these companies have been pushing, most people would say, well, that's flatly illegal according to the Civil Rights Act. This idea that you would judge people or hire people based on the color of their skin. What are you doing? Right. And now you actually have an administration in place who knows what the law is and is willing to enforce it.
I think that's certainly part of it, right? And that's certainly like the stick, right? But honestly, I think with the carrot being removed for DEI policies, they're not interested in doing it. And there's a good reason for that, because it creates all sorts of headaches internally. It creates all sorts of friction between, presumed identity groups about who's getting what and who's got priority over who. And most businesses don't really want to deal with that. No. All they want to do is hire good people to get the job done. That's really all they really want to focus on. Now, there are some activist companies out there that like this stuff. Nobody's telling them they can't do it. But until now, the threat of regulation or prosecution, whatever you want to say, government intervention, was on the side of not doing DEI. If you weren't doing DEI, you were at risk for doing that. Well, now, if you are doing DEI, there's a risk for that. But actually, I think with the incentives removed, they're all going to say, it's great. I don't want to do this. We never wanted to do it in the first place. We were just doing it to get by. Yeah. And I think the incentives are now set properly, and these companies are going to do what most companies do, which is to focus on making money and returning value for shareholders. Yeah, well, that's long overdue, because I've been saying for years, I'm like, really? There's a profit incentive in this madness? And I guess there must have been. I wasn't a part of giving my money to it, though. Ed Morrissey, thank you. Really appreciate your time, sir.